Many in the world don't realize that a large chunk of the vaccines which are given to children and adults in the world are actually made in India. So, what will be India's role when it comes to vaccinating the world against COVID 19?
Well, we must keep in mind that, through the global agencies for vaccine immunization and distribution, India supplies a very large part of the vaccines. Two of three vaccines which the globe gets in the UNICEF programs are made in India. That's terrific. 250 million African lives have been saved by vaccines made in India. So these are not small numbers, and these are very impressive. But what is even more impressive today is how the Indian scientific community, academia, industry, and the vaccine developers have come together in addition to also develop vaccines. So there are many vaccines being developed here. So no matter who develops vaccines, India will play a major role in manufacturing, stockpiling, and distribution to the world and for India also.
Well, creating a vaccine against COVID is considered in the same league as the mission to get to a man on the moon. Welcome to this very special session coming to you from New Delhi, India. We are talking about challenges of communicating science in the world's largest democracy. 1.3 billion people, vibrant democracy, a country where governments change without any strife, 100% electronic voting in India. And I have with me Prof K VijayRaghavan. He is a chemical engineer by training, but now a biologist. And to us science communicators, he is a role model in science communication. India is a country which has 22 official languages and another 1600 languages. Professor VijayRaghavan speaks English, Hindi, Tamil, and another South Indian language, Kannada, which he says partly, and another language which is the language of science where he speaks among scientists. More importantly, he speaks a language which even the Prime Minister of India can understand, and something which a layperson like me understands. My name is Pallava Bagla, and I'm a science photojournalist working out of India. Professor VijayRaghavan, while you were at the National Center for Biological Sciences, you in a way pioneered science communication from the side of the scientists. And now you are the principal scientific advisor to the government of India, looking at it from a perch. So what are the challenges you face in communicating science? And don't tell me, Pallav, you are the biggest challenge.
Well, yes, journalists are a challenge. And journalists are a challenge not because there's anything right or wrong with them, but really they are the interface between scientists and the community. And their persistence and their requirement for clarity, authentic sources, and documentation is what keeps scientists in a position where they can interact with the public. So were it not for journalists, scientists would not be improving their communication skills, nor perhaps would they be challenged enough to communicate on their own. Today's world is interesting in that scientists more and more appreciate the value of communication. They do talk to journalists a lot more, but they also talk more responsibly. And also because of social media, they have learned how to communicate better themselves. So all in all, I think this is a good sign that communication is improving. Of course, there are lots of other challenges, but there are many positive things too.
Certainly. But how, as a scientist, how do you address, by and large, scientists speak English and look at English as a way of communication. You yourself have said now even science should be practiced in vernacular languages, which is in the mother tongue. How do you address the challenge of reaching the vast masses of India and in different languages?
One of the really fascinating aspects of science journalism and science communication today is the extent and quality of what is available in many languages across the world, in English, in Spanish, in German, French, and so on. In India, substantially what is available in our languages is by translation. And therefore, that too needs to change. So we need to do two things: substantial original writing in our languages, which in science and science communication, which then is translated into other languages, including English, and the other way around also. We have, by the way, a good example to follow over here. If you look at our literature, there's enormous literature of great depth and quality, both contemporary and older literature, which is available in our languages. And there is a tradition of translating that into English, for example. That tradition needs to be emulated in science bidirectionally. That's beginning to happen largely by a combination of quality translators and quality automation. And so I think we're going to see better two-way communication in science between languages, using different languages in both directions.
Uh, while we are still talking about science and science journalism, today a lot of scientists communicate in what are called international journals. Do you think there is a time for countries of the South to get together and have a journal which is led from South, equivalent to the quality of, say, Cell, Science, or Nature? Because today online you can do so much. So do you think there is an opportunity which is waiting to be tapped?
Well, the world of publications, scientific publications, is today substantially a product of a huge anachronism which is crumbling. You have these big structures you referred to, which really are products of a print era, right? Their whole model, the business model, as it were, was a product of the print era. There were many valuable aspects which they brought in, which was a review process and a benchmarking of quality. And that too has become an anachronism because of the growth of the scientific enterprise to such an extent that these journals are no longer necessarily the benchmarks of quality alone. True, there are no shortage of high quality papers which they publish, but there's also a struggle both in terms of doorkeeping by preventing other quality papers from coming in, but also because of the volume which they get and the value which is perceived from these journals, that they often filter in articles which shouldn't be there. So that model is also crumbling. So I think we're soon going to see a model where it's not necessarily a national or a US or a European journal, but quality journals popping up from many locations. Keep in mind that all these journals you spoke about and many others have even now at their administrative and technology backend anchors in India. So in terms of getting the tech right for quality publishing, India has the ability. The challenge is to get good editorial participation and a sustainability, and that requires resources. And I think there's a great room for doing that. So Indian journals, international journals based in places like India, have a great future in a very new model, but not in the old model.
Certainly, many don't, people look at only the predatory journals come from India, but most of the back end offices of Nature, Springer, all of them are based in India. Thousands of people in India work to create those journals from India. So there is a viable model out there, definitely. Professor VijayRaghavan, we are speaking to each other during times of COVID and we are speaking virtually, so both of us don't have masks on each other. One of the big success stories from India is the masking of India and saving the world. And I distinctly remember well before WHO or CDC or others came up with the idea of using masks, not just N95, but homemade masks. You played a critical role from zero masks to let's look at only India where there are almost everybody wearing masks. So maybe over 1 billion people wearing masks. How did you communicate this?
Well, I think, Pallav, we must point out that this was an enormous challenge for the following reason, and also the people who tilted the balance to propagate the use of masks. The challenge really was that, conventional wisdom, as it were, in the medical profession at the start of the pandemic conflated two issues. It conflated the importance of the medics having access to N95 masks and the danger of public, grabbing those masks away from them with another agenda of the value of masks as protection. And that was the error which a lot of public communication made. We don't want to be, in a situation where healthcare workers don't have masks. So let's not propagate the value of masks. They need it, but you don't. And that logic somehow didn't seem valid. Because you're again conflating two different issues. You're talking about the value for the healthcare professionals on one side who need this, and how masks compared to not having masks is of value for the population in general. So the comparison, the baseline is very different. Now, this is something which was taken up by my office by a senior scientist there, Dr. Shailja Gupta, and
she played a key role.
And she played a critical role in articulating this. She did a lot of due diligence and pointed out how other countries were already showing importance for the use of masks, such as the Czech Republic and a few other places, even though it hadn't caught on in a big way. And she insisted on collecting whatever early stage documentation there was and making a very, very strong case. This, by the way, also came to the attention of the Prime Minister himself, who said that, look, this is something very important and must be done. So, the establishment, as it were, which goes slow and steady on many aspects, as it should, was pushed into adopting masks, face covers for the public on a much larger scale by the efforts of Dr. Shailja Gupta, principally from my office, working with the health ministry, working with the government, and the Prime Minister's nudge was very important.
Oh, certainly. I have never seen a suggestion made and within less than 10 days, the Prime Minister of India himself came on wearing a face cover and telling Indians to wear a face cover. But taking it across India, wasn't that a challenge for you?
Well, once the message got rolling, there was an amplification which was much more than the content and the place where the first messages were given. So again, Dr. Shailja Gupta and her team got the masks, the face cover manuals, as it were, translated into every language, and do-it-yourself directions given there. and we also contacted every state government. Many state governments got to us, wanted to know what kind of cloth to use and so on. And it really, for a variety of reasons, it really empowered people that here was something they could do about this pandemic themselves. So that value was also important in addition to the intrinsic value of the mask. And therefore, it caught on quite a lot, much more than I really thought it would in terms of the speed and extent.
No, hats off to you, like I say, masking India and saving the world. As the principal scientific advisor and staying along with the corona pandemic in these times, you are in a way leading the effort for giving a vaccine against the coronavirus. Will we get a vaccine? You've been a biologist now for over 30 years. And if a vaccine comes, what will be India's role in providing immunity to the world community?
Yes, so let me get to that question, but just one quick other point about masks. The credit again goes to our teams and to our central and state governments who are pushing that and continuing to do so.
No doubt.
Since I think it's important to keep multiple aspects in mind. There are some diseases which are very recalcitrant to the development of vaccines. The SARS coronavirus 2 does not, the COVID-19 disease which it causes, does not seem to be so far in that category. So that's the good news. Now, keep also in mind that vaccines typically take a very long time to develop because usually they're not developed in the context of pandemics, but also safety, efficacy, immunogenicity, costs all play a huge factor, and regulatory hoops have become more and more complex for two reasons: to ensure safety and efficacy, but also quite often there has been over the last decade a view that more regulation is somehow better regulation. Now, it is in this background that we are faced with rapidly developing a vaccine in today's pandemic. And there, to the credit of global vaccine developers, the science community in general, of which India is a major part, we have seen a very valuable paring down of the complexity and trying multiple routes to vaccine development simultaneously. Also, stockpiling and manufacturing even before approvals, and that's a huge financial risk. Putting in place the delivery pipelines before they are needed. So all of this means that it's what normally takes decades, we are trying to do in a year or a year and a half. That requires enormous resources, and the world has come together quite well over there.
Many in the world don't realize that a large chunk of the vaccines which are given to children and adults in the world are actually made in India. So what will be India's role when it comes to vaccinating the world against COVID-19?
Well, we must keep in mind that, through the global agencies for vaccine immunization and distribution, India supplies a very large part of the vaccines. Two of three vaccines which the globe gets in the UNICEF programs are made in India. That's terrific. 250 million African lives have been saved by vaccines made in India. So these are not small numbers, and these are very impressive. But what is even more impressive today is how the Indian scientific community, academia, industry, and the vaccine developers have come together in addition to also develop vaccines. So there are many vaccines being developed here. So no matter who develops vaccines, India will play a major role in manufacturing, stockpiling, and distribution to the world, and for India also.
Well, creating a vaccine against COVID is considered in the same league as the mission to get to a man on the moon. Let's turn our attention to one of India's flagship programs, which is the space program. India is a country which reached the moon in its maiden attempt, even Mars in its maiden attempt. uh, how difficult or easy it is for India and people like you to convey the excitement around space, especially for a country which has so many poor people.
Well, there are two components in our India's space effort. And, in the early days of our space program, um, the leaders of those programs, Vikram Sarabhai and Satish Dhawan, put in a very important statement in our space program. And basically, what was it that distinguished our space program from the program of other countries? And that, they said, was the link between space and society. So space has done two things in India. It's actually transformed the lives of our people in agriculture, in education, and in health, for example, by the use of satellites to deliver in these sectors. And this is something which is really widely appreciated by everyone everywhere in India. In addition, space holds all over the world a thrall and excitement which astronomy, space holds for people everywhere. So that's something, so it's not a difficult challenge to have people accept the importance of space. It really excites people tremendously.
Well, as
But,
principals,
but you have been a journalist covering the space sector a long time.
that is,
What has been your reaction, in terms of which you get from people when you talk about space? Is it difficult to convey the excitement of space, or is it very easily appreciated?
no, it's a challenge. And I'm so happy that we're having a discussion and not a one-way question answer between me and you. No, I have covered space now for 2 decades. It's been a wonderful journey covering India's space program. Uh, Conveying complexities of space in a language which lay people understand is certainly a challenge. And when you talk to quality engineers and scientists, they talk a language which only they understand. To deconstruct that and make it accessible without dumping down, without diluting the science, and telling people the deep excitement about what happens in a clean room or when a rocket is made, has been an amazingly fulfilling journey. And trust me, it's not been easy. Earning the respect of the Indian Space Research Organization, to be able to work with them shoulder to shoulder in their clean rooms, has been a Herculean task. I wish we could have the same kind of openness as we go along. There has been aspects where the Indian space program is closing its doors for good coverage, but then the excitement of space is immense. And Professor Vijayaraghavan, in times to come, that is something which is going to excite Indians and the world. Having covered space for a long time, so many times when I go out walking on the road or I am in the market, I'm stopped by people and said, "Oh, here goes a man who works for ISRO." So that is the kind of love and affection which people give me, having covered space so intensely and so deeply. And I love covering space. There is no doubt about that. But there are many other aspects about India, and which many people in the world don't quite fathom. One of our other big feathers in the cap for India, and something which I have also covered and you have also seen closely, Professor Vijayaraghavan, is India's atomic energy program. As they say, we have end-to-end capability in space. We also have end-to-end capability in the atomic energy sector. That is one area where communication is a very big challenge. And compared to space, that is a bigger challenge. I can tell you how I find it difficult, but from the perspective, from your perch, how do you convey the excitement of atomic energy, which is always hidden behind a shroud?
Of course, there are enormous challenges in communicating what goes on in the nuclear sector in terms of energy and applications of the nuclear sector. And the reasons for those historically are obvious. The term nuclear has meanings which are not always positive, and it's a constant barrier when there are positive aspects of nuclear use that one needs to overcome those barriers. But there's also another fundamental barrier which, in my view, can be overcome and which exists both with nuclear energy, for example, and with space, and also with many high-tech approaches in the context of countries of the South, the low and middle income countries. And the attitude, which is not just a cultural attitude, but a cultural plus commercial domination attitude, is that these technologies are not what should be developed, space and atomic energy, by the countries which are low and middle income, but they are meant to be used and imported by them, right? And that comes from a feeling of wanting to do good. You need to first address health and education and poverty, and then sort all those out before you get into developing these a variety of cutting-edge technologies. Now, that attitude has been overturned for two reasons. One, India, unlike many post-colonial countries many decades ago, chose these technologies along with addressing other fundamental problems. And those values for those are enormous. But today's world now also has an enormous demand, which these and other technologies, which combine internet and manufacturing, bring. And those are, how can we have sustainable development in a context where that requirement, there's a requirement additionally of not exploiting anyone else, any other society, any other country, or your own population. That requires access to energy and communication and tools on a scale which are much more equitable. And space and atomic energy provide that in enormous ways, along with other forms of energy, solar, wind, and also other tools such as electronics and the internet in extraordinary ways, which we can talk about if we have time. So we need to have much more ownership of the new developments in these technologies from the South, rather than seeing them as expensive toys to be used with pride.
Certainly, these are not toys. I have closely gone in and out of nuclear reactors so many times. And the moment you go in and see how silent a nuclear reactor is, and you see people working there with clinical precision, that is when you start. And I developed a respect, a very healthy respect for what is happening behind those high walls and those guards which guard a nuclear facility. And no doubt, in climate change, we definitely need a carbon free, reliable base load of energy. And in my opinion, both fission and the upcoming fusion may offer some of that. Very quickly, diverting away from something which is very, very relevant to us. You are somebody who's very active on the social media. And the social media today, in some ways, has become synonymous with spread of disinformation. So as a scientist, how do you tackle this whole disinformation which is spread on social media, especially what's called the WhatsApp university?
Well, I think this is a serious problem, of course, and there's no easy solution. Um, but there's a lesson from the pandemic. Just as physical distancing can prevent the rapid spread of a virus, I think distancing on social media from fake news can also help a lot. When you see something which is obviously wrong, it is better to counter it without highlighting it as here is an example of what is obviously wrong. Because in doing the latter, you're actually helping propagate it also. So nuanced, responses, retorts to fake news without, in the process, amplifying the news is very, very important. It's also good to keep calm and respond, a day or two later and address the topic in this manner rather than immediately amplify it to a discussion, which again helps in propagating fake news.
I agree. I disagree with you on a term called fake news. I am a journalist, and most journalists who do news and news reporting are not prone to doing fake neuse. This is a term which emerges largely from one of world's very favorite leaders. Let's leave him unnamed. But fake news is not journalism. It should ideally be called disinformation because these are motivated people who are doing this with a very specific purpose in mind. Uh, any thoughts or ideas you have a journalist sitting in front of you. Very rarely do you get an opportunity to ask a question or two to a journalist.
There's a term, I'd love to ask you a question. There's a term which is called Gell-Mann amnesia. And the physicist Murray Gell-Mann talked about this. And I'd like to ask you about that. So the Gell-Mann amnesia goes as follows. If you pick up the newspaper and look at a topic which you're deeply familiar with, you find all sorts of flaws in it in terms of fact and interpretation and so on. That's because you're an expert in that area. Now you go on to the next topic, which let's say is something which you have no idea about, and you read it, and you assume that everything is perfectly fine as written. So you suddenly have amnesia about the previous article you read, right? And you're willing to accept uncritically the next one because it's not in your area. And therefore, there's an enormous responsibility on journalists to ensure that there is less scope for this kind of a Gell-Mann amnesia. And given the pressures of time which journalists have and the speed with which they need to get things out, how do you deal with fact-checking and with responsibility and ensuring that nuances are also conveyed is my part one of my two-part question. The second part is...
Let me answer this first part.
Yeah.
Wonderful question, because most people want to know how we do our craft. There are no shortcuts. Being easy on facts can only earn you one-night stands. You cannot have abiding respect of your viewers, readers, and the audience unless you have a track record of doing credible, fact-based journalism. Most newspapers, television stations, or news portals have a mechanism to filter stuff. It no longer happens that you want to do something and it goes straight on air. I have been on live television umpteen number of times, but then there is a filter. So that filtration process takes care. A lot of times there is a rush to put a tweet out, and that puts a lot of restriction because you have a number of characters you have is 140 or 280, and that puts a restriction. So I always urge people to go to credible news sources to gather news. Don't rely just on forwards from friends or in the circle. So I hope that answers. And in almost 25, 30 years of journalism, when you do journalism on a daily basis, you will make mistakes. It's not that you don't make mistakes, but then you need to correct them and move on and learn from it. And that is the basis of good journalism. But yes, in pandemic times, many journalists are losing jobs. So there is a crisis out there, and I'm hoping it will get addressed soon.
You
I'm
know,
ready to take your second question.
well, second question related to this is in terms of documentation of all what you said. You know, journalists rightly interview people in detail, and then when they write an 800-word article or a 500-word article, much of what they discussed is left out. Also, something else happens, which is not necessarily in the journalist's hands. The clickbait headline often distorts the content of the article, even without the writer's own um, acknowledgement or acceptance of that. So the result of both these is that, you know, in the public you have articles whose headlines are clickbait, and you know, and the content itself is sort of an abridged version, leading to the view that, you know, as long as you're in the news, it's fine. It doesn't matter whether the article says something good or bad or sensible or not. Now, a solution to this, if I could suggest to science journalists, is while you write your article, why not have the full interview, um, full transcript also available on a website, either of the interviewers or the interviewee, so that, you know, those who want to look at details can go and look at it.
Certainly, and you're familiar. I have practiced that particular style of journalism for a long time. I do my interviews, the videos go separately, my writing goes separately. Sometimes, yes, in the written form, you might have only a three or four, five, six sentence quote, but the full interview is usually available as a link for people to 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 watch, for people who are deeper, who have deeper interest in it. Which is why, see, you have short news stories, from tweets to short news stories to features to longer interviews, and all of these forms, and then going on to books. And books remain a very important part today. They haven't gone away, whatever people may say. They remain a part. So, in so many years of practicing journalism, I have found shorter news to full length books. Take the case of Chandrayaan 1, which is India's maiden mission to the moon. I reported from, there was no tweets then, so there was only SMS. So that was restricted to about 40, 50 words, to 100,000 word book. All forms I have reported. Same thing for the Mars orbiter mission. By then, tweets had come in from 140 character to a 80,000 word book. So there is opportunity and for people to delve in. But to expect that for a journalist to do on a daily basis to transcribe full interviews, I think is expecting a little too much, because there are pressures of daily news reporting, which daily news journalists face. But I think a point well taken, and something which I'm sure the Science Journalism Forum will internalize and take forward.
I have one more question.
Sure.
And that relates to, you know, opportunities for people entering the profession of science journalism, particularly as freelance writers and particularly as women. The amount of back-end infrastructure support in terms of access to archival material, other kinds of documentation, storing them like we discussed just now, and so on, would be invaluable for people whose survival in their careers is usually for a long time very precarious. Are there global mechanisms or national mechanisms which you as science journalists could initiate so that the costs for entering this profession, the barriers are lowered, making it available to people, as I said, particularly women and people who write in many languages, to be able to enter?
I wish there were an easy answer. journalism is a very lonely profession, Professor VijayRaghavan. You practice science, you're lonely in your lab, but you have lab mates. But by and large, as journalists, we lead a very lonely life. Uh, we nuzzle information, we dig out stuff, we put it out at the right time. And today, entry is not hard, but today, thanks to entry is not hard because of internet, but then sustaining it as a career is not easy because the returns on journalism have come down very heavily. Uh, how that would get corrected is something only time would tell. And COVID has taken, uh, has affected journalism in a very big way. While the need for information is very high, but the job losses and the investments by way of advertisements in television channels and in newspapers is downhill. So it is a challenge, but somebody like me who's pursued it now for 3 decades, I can say with some conviction, I could have opted to be a political journalist. I could have opted to be a cinema or a Hollywood or a Bollywood journalist, or opted to be a crime reporter. I opted to be a science and technology reporter, and I have loved every minute of it. Getting to interact with some of the brightest minds of the world is something which is so precious and so fulfilling. And it has helped me learn so much. And in a way, I can say with some satisfaction, it has helped empower India's democracy, because that is for me an abiding interest. And we are speaking on a subject which is challenges of communicating science in the world's largest democracy. So having seen so many prime ministers, so many ministers, but empowering people with information so that they take right decisions is the most satisfying part of journalism which I have pursued. Any closing thoughts for you?
Well, I think the value of journalism in general and science journalism and science communication in particular is enormous in policy making context. We must keep in mind that governments everywhere in the world, including in India, look at every single report. It's always very difficult to sift out the complexities, but there are people doing that to learn from what is communicated in professional journals, in different detailed circles where experts are there, but also where journalism brings it to the fore. So the role of journalism is very, very important and has enormous impact. So kudos to all of you and your teams all over the world for what they're doing.
Certainly. Not easy to do journalism in India. It's a complex place, 22 official languages, so many different ways of telling the same story. But personally, it has been a lovely career which has given me so much. And getting to spend time with beautiful minds like you is certainly a benefit which I have loved every minute of it. Uh, let's close this interview in COVID times with something which is being adopted by the world with a namaskar, because that is such a lovely way of greeting people, something which comes from India, which is without touch. When you come in, you do a namaskar, and when you go out, you do a namaste or a namaskar, and it helps check the spread of the coronavirus. So thanks a lot, Dr. VijayRaghavan, and a namaskar to you, and a namaskar to the entire world. Like I said many times, Corona harega, desh jeetega. Meaning, we will defeat Corona and we will win the battle against the COVID-19 virus. Have a good day, Professor VijayRaghavan.
You too. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pallava.